This is one of those videos where there's something to piss off everyone, so please read the description before leaving an angry comment. I think this is going to end up being my one big what do you think of transgender people and gender dysphoria video, simply because I have 3 distinct topics on this issue that I'd like to talk about, and might as well put them all in one video. Alright, first topic. Should gender dysphoria be classified as a disease? It's listed in the DSM as a disease, but then again, so was homosexuality at one point. And yes, for the purposes of this video, I am going to be equating transgender people to people with gender dysphoria. I realize that there are trans people who call themselves trans who can just get by dressing and acting differently without a formal diagnosis of gender dysphoria. I've got to start with something concrete, so I'm going to start here, and that's also part of the reason why I'm not going to be discussing so-called gender fluid people either. One of the things that got me thinking about this was actually a video by the YouTuber Computing Forever in which he reported Canada can take children away from their parents if the parents don't help them transition.
This proposed legislation permits the CAS to withdraw a child from its family if it is determined the child is likely to suffer emotional or mental harm, or for a parent's failure to provide the child with services or treatment. If a child decides he/she is of a gender other than his/her biological gender, the parents are required by this legislation to provide transgender medical services to the child or risk the child being removed from the home.
As I was watching this video, I couldn't shake the thought that says, okay, but if gender dysphoria really is a mental disorder, if it really is a disease, as I believe Computing Forever would say, then you are essentially denying your kids treatment for a real medical condition. I don't think that's a good thing. I think that is something that the government should be able to come in and say, no, you should give your kids proper medical care. And I think the broader problem that informs this and similar problems is the impasse over whether or not to call gender dysphoria, transgender people, transgenderism, a disease. There seems to be agreement that transgender people exist, but a lot of people on both sides of the debate seem to be stuck on whether or not we call it a disease or not. Is it a disease or is it my identity? And this really brings us to the bottom line of my first point, which is the fact that trans activists don't want to call transgenderism, gender dysphoria, a disease. And in case you couldn't tell, I disagree. Now, I sympathize with the argument that says, hey, it's not a disease, it's my identity, it's who I am. But if gender dysphoria is not a disease, then how are you going to hold parents accountable for not helping their children transition, taking them to a doctor? If it's not a disease, then how do you expect your healthcare system to pay for your hormones and surgery? And perhaps most importantly, if it's not a disease, well then, what else do you call it when people are, as far as we can tell, born with a mental condition which causes them inherent distress, which they would like to get rid of, for which there is a reasonably effective treatment? I would call that a disease. And as I mentioned, according to the DSM-5, gender dysphoria is a disease, with emphasis on the inherent distress that it causes. This is unlike homosexuality, which was removed decades ago, and I believe part of the reason it was removed is simply because it doesn't actually cause any inherent distress. Now, of course, there is social bullying, but compare that to transgender people, many of whom will say, yeah, I really felt like something was wrong from a really young age. No one had to tell me that. It just felt wrong. The primary reason I can see for why trans activists don't want gender dysphoria classified as a disease is simply because the word sounds bad. And yeah, of course it does, but even though classifying it as a disease has good practical results, as far as I can tell, apparently those results are not worth the stigma of the word. And to be perfectly honest, this seems like par for the course for these types of social justice activists. Telling pregnant women not to drink alcohol is bad because it stigmatizes pregnant women who may have only had a few sips. Rape prevention and self-defense advice is bad because it stigmatizes rape victims for maybe not resisting enough. Even though these messages do reduce the instances of fetal alcohol syndrome, and even though they do reduce instances of completed rapes, apparently neither of these results is worth the stigma, according to social justice activists. I mean, here's just a thought experiment to put it into perspective. Go up to a new mother who somehow didn't get the memo about fetal alcohol syndrome, or go up to a rape victim who didn't know how to defend themselves, and reassure them that their sacrifice saved literally hundreds of people from a stigma. Or, just to bring this full circle, go up to a transgender person who can't afford to transition because their healthcare won't cover it because it's not a disease, and tell them that while they may feel like an alien in their own body every day of their lives, at least they're not being stigmatized for technically having a disease. I would say that this is a fundamental pitfall of framing literally everything in terms of power structures and social pressures. You tend to forget about the practical results of what you're doing, and you end up doing more harm than good, even if your intentions are golden. I also suspect that another underlying contention or underlying fear in this debate, at least here on YouTube, comes in part from Blair White's kind of misinforming videos on transgender kids, specifically the claim or the implied claim that kids can basically get hormones and transition whenever they feel like it, when in reality there seems to be an involved medical procedure to screen people for actually having dysphoria, as opposed to simply being gay or a tomboy, which can be misdiagnosed as dysphoria. As far as I can tell, parents really don't have the medical authority to declare that their child is trans and to get them hormones. Furthermore, and this is another fear that I believe is fueling this debate, puberty blockers simply delay the onset of puberty. They do not initiate the transition, and as far as I can tell, they are completely reversible. Alright, moving on to point number 2, transgender athletes. I want to make my position on this topic clear, mostly just so I don't confuse people as I move into my third point. My position is that the whole point of dividing sports into men's and women's events is not to account for personal identity, but to ensure that female athletes still get a chance to compete and win. It's a similar situation to weight classes in other sports. The problem is, when we first made men's and women's categories, man meant biological male and woman meant biological female, which for many people is no longer the case, but we're stuck with these categories, hence the impasse. I think the solution to this problem is roughly what the YouTuber Noel Plum outlined, which is basically where you make one set of events the female-only events, and the other events are the open, anyone-can-compete events. I've put a link to his video in the description, and I'd highly suggest you watch it after this one, because I think he does a great job of explaining the problems and what we might do to solve them. And finally, the third topic, the idea that transgender people need real help. I was watching a video by Tim Pool on transgender athletes, and while I agreed with his take on the issue, I was surprised to find a lot of comments that said something along the lines of, transgender people need real help. Pumping your body full of hormones is not the answer. These comments seemed really strange to me because it's my understanding that transgender people are already getting real help. That's what hormone therapy and surgery is. It's the best option they have to alleviate their distress. I mean, what real help do you think these people are not getting? Now, of course, in an ideal world, gender dysphoria would be treatable with a pill, or possibly by some sort of deep brain stimulation like TMS, but those options simply don't exist right now. What else do you expect these people to do? Now, as it just so happens, my opinion on hormone therapy and surgery for transgender people is actually fairly similar to my opinion on assisted suicide, at least in principle, which basically says, hey, unless there's a better way to alleviate these people's suffering, it seems like the best we can do is to give them these things, subject to a mental evaluation to make sure it's what they actually want. Now, of course, these are not perfect solutions by any means, but they're the best ones we have. Saying that trans people need real help is like saying that terminally ill patients in horrible pain shouldn't get to die sooner to end their suffering. We're just going to try our best to make them as comfortable as possible, even if it's not really possible. I mean, for these things, we have a solution to alleviate these people's suffering. You just don't like it, and frankly, that's not your call to make. In an ideal world, we would have super effective painkillers, but we don't. In an ideal world, we would have a pill that people could take to treat gender dysphoria, but we don't. The best things we have are assisted suicide and gender transition procedures, respectively, and I don't see why, subject to a detailed medical review, we should deny people these options if they want them. I really despise this idea, this fake sympathy, if you will, where people are essentially saying, yeah, we totally want to help you, we totally want to help these people, but not that way. That's the icky way. Even if it's the best way we've got, we're not doing it.